Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd for some more Russian history. In this video I'm going to be concentrating on the end of World War I for Russia and the Russian Civil War, which runs through from 1918 through into 1920 roughly. It's very difficult to pin down, which is so unusual in the war. So this is a really key part of the early establishment of the Bolshevik regime. So to start off with the end of World War I, in terms of the Russian involvement in the First World War, well, Lenin and Trotsky both assumed that as the Bolsheviks seized power, that this would be a catalyst. This would promote that kind of revolutionary change in other nations as well, because according to Marxist theory, it really should be happening in the major industrialized Western powers before it happened in Russia. So many of the Western countries, particularly in the midst of the war, in particular Germany, looked ripe for a revolution. So in that way, kind of the war ending to a lot of the Bolsheviks, like Lenin, looked like it was fairly inevitable. Now, the Bolsheviks had promised peace, but the peace that was being offered by Germany would lead to a loss of a huge amount of land and resources to the new Bolshevik government. It would in turn strengthen Imperial Germany, making revolution there less likely. So the Bolsheviks are in a slightly difficult position. So they've promised peace and they are being offered peace, but the peace that they're being offered comes at a massive cost and it counters their hopes for worldwide revolution. Now, Bukharin and others argued that the Bolsheviks should continue the war and refuse to make treaties to treat with capitalist nations, increasing the chances of world revolution. That if they continued to fight against Germany, then the German workers would see the need for revolution and they would rise up and overthrow the Kaiser, and you would not only then have a socialist government in Russia, you'd also have one in Germany as well. Trotsky, probably the most idealistic, was kind of going, well, actually, we should do neither peace nor war. I'm not quite sure how you achieve that, but he's kind of like, we shouldn't pursue the war, but we should essentially just defend ourselves, and we should retreat and wait for revolution in the West, because it's bound to happen. It's coming. Obviously, those hopes were proved to be unfounded. If the Bolsheviks continued to fight the war, however, this would exacerbate and make worse the economic situation in Russia and the suffering of the Russian people. And it would also mean that Lenin was breaking one of his key promises, going back to his April thesis of peace, bread and land. Well, actually continuing the war would probably lead to an absence of peace, not only an absence of peace, but probably an absence of bread as well. So Lenin took a more pragmatic approach than to the ones being produced by Trotsky and Bukharin. And I imagine there's a personal element to this. It was him who had promised peace. So he signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and this can be seen really as a pragmatic rather than an ideological decision. Now, the cost of it is quite mind-blowing. So Russia lost 2 million square kilometers of land, which had on it 62 million people, a sixth of Russia's population, 26% of its railway lines, 74% of its iron ore and coal supplies, a third of its agricultural production. Now, Finland, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia would all ultimately become independent states, and actually the fighting for their independence becomes part of the civil war that will follow on. Bessarabia was given to Romania, which was a key German ally. Georgia, Belarus, Ukraine had semi-independent governments set up. So the Bolsheviks are losing a lot to gain peace. On top of this, of course, in making the agreement with Germany, this caused incredible anger with Russia's existing allies, because Russia leaving the war would mean that Germany could concentrate on the Western front, no longer having to fight in the East, and this would probably prolong and possibly even change the course of the war in the West. So this is really, really difficult thing to take from the Western powers, and that means they are going to help those that oppose the Bolsheviks. There was a great deal of opposition to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And it really is a good example of the tension between Marxist ideology and practical consideration. Lenin ultimately here essentially decides to sacrifice the idea of international revolution, which you can see the ideas of Bukharin and even more extreme Trotsky kind of really pushing towards it in the interest of preserving the Bolshevik revolution in Russia, because the fear was if Russia overstretched and was trying to promote revolution elsewhere, that actually it would all collapse in and the Bolsheviks might lose power. So this idea of this determined group clinging onto power was a kind of key idea from Lenin. The left socialists, so the left of the SR, who had joined the government with Lenin and the Bolsheviks at this point, resigned in protest. And there was a great deal of unrest and unhappiness about the treaty within Russia. There was assassination attempt on Lenin himself by a member of the left SR, which left him badly wounded in the neck. This wound is said to have contributed to the strokes that he has over the next few years, which ultimately lead to his death. Obviously, it's a prolonged period with the several strokes and a long period of illness. The level of opposition was really high across the political spectrum. Former cadets and conservatives, and obviously members of the left SR, really kind of were angered by what the Bolsheviks had done, and this really feeds into making a civil war in Russia inevitable. Now the impact, and we've seen a bit on this of this already, was fairly enormous. So we've got all that land and all that production that's been lost. The bread ration in Petrograd fell to 50 grams per person per day, which is incredibly low. The transport system was at the point of collapse. It was massively disrupted. The Petrograd workforce had fallen by 60%. Actually, the population of Petrograd fell from 3 million to 2 million. As people just left and went out into the countryside. Of course, we got this whole thing with land being seized and redistributed, and a lot of the peasantry that moved to Petrograd to work was kind of going home to try and make sure they made their claim on their bit of land. The SR attempted a coup in Moscow, which was the new capital, in 1918. There were 2 attempts on Lenin's life in July and August 1918, and other Bolsheviks, including 2 of the party bosses, were assassinated. And the SR joined the whites in opposition to the Bolsheviks. Now, depending on what you read on this, and there's huge amounts of really interesting stuff written on the Russian Civil War. In a lot of the stuff I've read, then the SR, the groups who support the SR within the Civil War, are often referred to as the Greens. I've seen other bits of writing that have given them different associations, and associated the Greens with the nationalist groups. But in most of the reading I've done, the SR forces are often referred to as the Greens, but the Greens essentially are fighting on the same side as the whites against the Bolsheviks, who are seen as the Reds. It is a complicated war because there are many different factions. The only really constant is in the middle is the Bolsheviks, the Red and their Red Army, who are fighting against basically everybody else. It's very difficult to date the Russian Civil War because it's not really formally declared, so it doesn't really have a start date. It's not just the Bolsheviks versus some political enemies. It's more complicated than that. The Bolsheviks claimed that it was a class war. It wasn't, because a lot of the peasantry and the workers are fighting for the Green and White armies against the Bolsheviks. So it's not as simple as being about class. And then there were actually people from the higher classes in the Bolsheviks, and so that bit is a bit of a red herring, I think, actually. There were lots of local and regional considerations. So, for example, places like the Ukraine and Georgia were fighting for independence. So were things like Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania and Finland. And so some of those nationalist groups, they aren't actually worried about whether the Bolsheviks are defeated in Russia. They just don't want them in their country. They wanted independence from Russia for a long period of time, and they're seeing this as their opportunity to get it. So the Bolsheviks, who were largely actually non-Russian, a large portion of the Bolsheviks were from other states, were actually fighting to ensure the Russian dominance over the rest of the Russian Empire. So in that way, it seems a little confusing as well. And we'll say, obviously, Stalin was in charge of Commissar for the nationalities, and he's actually Georgian, and so we see elements of all of that kind of in all this. And he probably does more later on to establish Russian dominance over the other states than anybody else. There was also foreign intervention at various points in the Civil War. And again, this is not from one country wanting to achieve one thing. This is from multiple countries. So we've got intervention from Britain, from France, from Italy, from Japan, from Germany, from Czechoslovakia, from Finland, from Lithuania, from Poland, from Romania, and the USA is another a major part of this as well. Where now they actually seem to be largely wanting to stop other countries going too far, but it really is a multinationally involved war, even though it's a civil war. So in that, it is again particularly unusual. Now, there were four kind of major fronts of, and what we've got is different white generals in charge of different white or green armies who are fighting against the Bolsheviks at different points, at different times, not in a coordinated way, wanting to achieve different things. You got Yudenich in the west, who's going in and fighting through Estonia. You've got Kolchak in the north and the east, who is coming in from that direction. You've got Denkin followed by Wrangel, who are fighting up from the south. So Wrangel fought initially alongside Denkin. He was one of his subordinates, and then resigned because he disagreed with how he was doing things, and then was brought back and replaced him. And they are just some of the key groups. Now, there's a map that I've taken off Wikipedia above me, which shows you kind of the bit in the middle to give you the idea of which where the Bolsheviks controlled, and then the different angles that these different groups were coming from. Now, obviously, if this all been coordinated, all attacked at the same time, and they'd all wanted the same thing, then it might well have worked. And another really important part in this was coming up through the southeast was the Czech Legion, which initially had been given passage and told that it could go and fight, and then it was kind of breaking its way through. Now, this Czech Legion was made up of 40,000 men, and this is a proper army on the move. So they wanted to join the Allies on the Western Front to fight on behalf of the Allies in hope of gaining Czechoslovakian independence. The Bolshevik leadership had given them kind of the right to cross Russia and go and do this, but local Bolsheviks disliked having this army crossing their land, and so they tried to stop them, and so it turned into the Czech region fighting its way across Russia, and they travelled along the Trans-Siberian railway, fighting their way as they went. Now, this encouraged other white groups, and groups such as the SR and the Cadets come out as being openly against the Bolsheviks. The SR uprisings in central Russia, the Volga Republic, at Samara, and all these things, again, this is often seen as the Greens in terms of part of the war. They start to really undermine Bolshevik control. The White Army that again we saw was one of the fronts that was run by Denkin, had formed in the Caucasus region and was coming up from the south, and that particular army was pro-Tsar. They banned other groups, including the Liberal Cadets in that region. We've got a White Army coming from Siberia under Kolchak. We've got in Estonia, we've got General Yudenich forming a White Army. So we've got these different armies under different generals in different places who want different things, and this again causes the confusion with the war, and in a way shows how impressive the Bolsheviks were in managing to hold this off. The bit that really means that happens is none of this is coordinated. Now, on top of that, I've already mentioned that there was foreign intervention, so let's have a look at that in a little bit more detail. Well, France and Britain at first were willing to work with the Bolsheviks. Essentially, they just wanted to keep Russia in the war, and they hoped they could persuade Lenin and his government to continue. Lenin refused, and so they switched the kind of resources and stuff they were putting into Russia, and they were really worried that the resources they put into Russia already would suddenly just now fall into German hands, and not only would Germany be fighting at one front, they'd actually be able to start using their own resources against them. So that meant that the French and the British were likely to support anti-Bolshevik groups in Russia and help them fight the war. And they were actually pushed into this further by the fact that not only was Lenin stopping fighting in the war, but he also made it clear that the Bolsheviks would not honour any foreign debts. So any debts owed to French and British governments or individuals, they were just going to be wiped off. And also, the Bolsheviks launched the Comintern, Communist International, which was going to try and spread revolution around the world, and that provoked the foreign powers as well. Some examples of stuff that involved foreign armies and foreign groups during the Civil War. In March 1918, British, French, and US force occupied the ports of Murmansk, which is in the Arctic, and Archangel, which is in the White Sea. In April, Japan occupied the far eastern port of Vladivostok. And there was an outrage then a little bit later in 1918 in July when news of the murder of the Tsarist family came out, and this caused international outrage. In August 1918, units from France, Britain, the US and Italy entered Vladivostok, and again, so they got more foreign troops in Russia. In January 1919, British battleships and British troops helped Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania defeat the Red Army and gain independence. And in 1919, Japan and US armies occupied parts of Siberia. And again, part of it, I think, with the US is trying to prevent the expansion of other powers like Japan. And the Japanese were the force that stayed longest in Russia. So again, a very complicated picture, lots of different foreign groups acting in different ways for different reasons, trying to achieve different things. So some of it is about trying to get the Bolsheviks out of power to get Russia back into the war. But obviously this continues, foreign intervention continues after the end of the war. So what's that about? Well, it's about reducing Bolshevik power. It's about the other problems that we call the idea of the spread of communism. It's to do with not honouring foreign debts. Japan is looking for opportunities to expand. The US is trying to create a kind of a post-war peace. So we've got whole different reasons for working different. And again, the foreign intervention is not wholehearted and it isn't coordinated. And so it is limited. Now, really, the Western powers didn't have the stomach for more protracted fighting. There were those very vocal anti-Bolshevik voices in both Britain and France and elsewhere. But there was fear, for example, that if you sent French and British more French and British regiments to Russia, there was a really good chance they would mutiny, partly because they were sick of fighting and partly because of potential sympathy for the soldiers and workers in Russia. And certainly there was support for the Bolsheviks amongst the trade union movement in the West, notably in France and in Britain. So acting in Russia would potentially stir up problems within the Western powers. Therefore, it was probably something best avoided getting too involved in. And there certainly was sympathy in a lot of the workers' groups in Britain and elsewhere for the Bolshevik cause. Now, I've hinted at a lot of this as we've gone through in terms of reasons for Bolshevik success. The main one is what I put at the top here, is there's just a lack of coordination of the whites, the green armies, the foreign powers. So they tended to attack individually at separate points, and the Bolsheviks, who controlled this central area, moved their army around, and they got wind of when an attack was coming, and they had enough people there to repulse that attack. And then they could move their people around, and they could fight off others. Now, if it had all been coordinated and people had all attacked from all these different directions, as we saw on the map earlier, at the same time, then it was probably unlikely the Bolsheviks could have survived it. But that was unlikely because the different powers didn't have an agreed thing that they were trying to achieve. A lot of them hated the Bolsheviks, but they hated them in different ways and for different reasons. Some people were fighting because they wanted independence for their country from Russia. Some wanted return of a strong central government or a czar or czar-like figure. Some wanted democracy. Some were the SR. They wanted socialism, just a slightly different form of socialism for the one that the Bolsheviks wanted, and the Mensheviks and others and things like that. So they wanted to have a say in government. They didn't want Bolshevik dominance, Bolshevik dictatorship. There's no single leader of all these white armies. We saw, I went through again very briefly, but there's different generals in different places. So there's no, whilst the Bolsheviks have strong central leadership under Lenin and Trotsky and others, that's not the case for the group that they're fighting against. Now, the fact that Bolsheviks controlled this concentrated central area, which included the major cities of Petrograd and Moscow, really, again, and they were the central areas of communication and population, that really helped them. They also controlled the railway networks. Again, as I talked about, they could move their men around and repel the various attacks from different directions. The Bolsheviks, although the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk had taken away lots of industrial power, they still control most of the industrial areas, which meant that they controlled and produced the munitions. And this meant that whites had to get their supplies from foreign powers. Again, and all this foreign support for the enemies of the Bolsheviks could use to portray themselves as fighting to defend Russia and the Russian people, whilst the whites were essentially the puppets of foreign capitalist powers. Now, both sides mistreated the population, so that the whites and the reds, so the Bolsheviks and their opponents, mistreated the population and seized things off them and left them to starve and stole and shot and all the rest of it. Now, there was in the war under the Bolsheviks, there was grain requisition, there was the Red Terror, but the whites couldn't gain a kind of proper propaganda advantage over this because the attacks on the population by the white armies were just as notorious, or as notorious in some places. So again, the Bolsheviks, although they did a lot very wrong, the whites couldn't stand up and go, well, we're the good guys and they aren't, because there weren't really any good guys in this. The involvement of pro-Tsarist groups amongst some of the white armies meant the Bolsheviks could suggest that a white victory would reverse land distribution, and it helped undermine support of groups like the SR. So they can then say, well, the SR are now fighting alongside the forces of the Tsar. So are they really on your side? Well, we're fighting against those forces, so we are. And again, that could help with the way that the Bolsheviks could present the civil war to those in the areas they controlled and outside the areas they controlled. So that is a kind of very brief sketch, really, of a very complicated, very interesting part of Russian history, and a war that is hugely significant in the development of Bolshevik reign. I hope it's been useful to you. If it has, then please hit like. If you have any questions or queries, then please stick them in the comments box. If you haven't subscribed already, then please do. I am making this playlist which looks at Tsarist and communist Russia. So I've started with Alexander II, gone through Alexander III, Nicholas II, into the provisional government, and now I'm onto the Bolsheviks, and I'm going to go all the way through till into the 1960s, going through Lenin and Stalin and Khrushchev. So this is aimed at A-level historians, but hopefully is useful and interesting to lots of other people as well. On my channel there are other history playlists, as well as loads and loads of stuff on UK and US politics and political ideology as part of my A-level politics playlists. Hope that's all useful to you. Thank you very much for watching.